Welcome to the Haven Collective. I'm JR and this is the Beacon Bit. Today we're reflecting on the triumphal entry in Luke's Gospel because this coming Sunday when we gather in our beacons is Palm Sunday. It's the beginning of Holy Week and it's the last Sunday of Lent. It remembers when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the Sunday before Easter, a week before Easter, and it began the week that led up to his crucifixion. So a lot of monumental stuff happened this Sunday. And as we're beginning, I want to consider the question today, and I really want to spend some time talking about it in our Beacon Bits, about how we know if we're following Jesus. Because this is what's provocative about the Palm Sunday experience. There are so many different groups of people that are vying for Jesus's attention and allegiance, and he's sort of in the midst of all of them walking through. So what I want to do is kind of walk through the different groups of people that we find in Luke's Gospel and consider how we might relate to them. And then where we're going to end up today is just asking the question that's going to carry us into our Beacon discussions about where we might find ourselves. Throughout the whole season of Lent, we've been reflecting on Christian nationalism, on this idea that America was founded as a Christian nation and that to be a good Christian, or to be a good American, you have to be a good Christian. It's this wedding of political power and religious desire that we have named as idolatrous and dangerous. And then we've been also asking what it looks like for us to love our Christian nationalist neighbors instead of condemning them, and love them in a way that's redemptive, that invites them to come out of their commitment to this false idol. So let's go to the triumphal entry. You have several different groups of people. First of all, I want to focus on the citizens of Jerusalem. Now remember, as we've talked about, Jerusalem was the seat of power. And there's a couple of different groups in Jerusalem at the time. There are the Jewish elites, so the scribes and the priests and the noble families and all of this, right? And then again, the citizens who live in the capital. So they're in proximity to political power. They have connections and all of that, right? Then there are the Romans who live there, the Romans who are the occupying army. And so there's always this careful dance between the Jews and the Romans to make sure that everyone is keeping the peace, because the last thing Rome needed to do was send an army out to lay waste to everyone. Spoilers, that does eventually happen about 40 years after this, and it is as terrible as you might imagine. So there's this constant jockeying to make sure that things don't get too political or too over the top. It's in the best interests, many of the priests and the ruling class think, to keep the religion tame, to keep all of this talk about, liberation from the evil empire at Passover, for instance, which is when this happens, as metaphor and ideas, not something that we would take seriously as though God would actually want to liberate us from political evils, right? Then there is the group that we would call the pilgrims who have come down from northern Palestine along with Jesus. Again, Passover is a major religious festival, and so somewhat in the same way that lots of people go to Washington, D.C. on the 4th of July to celebrate American independence, so a lot of people would come to Jerusalem for Passover to celebrate the birth of the people of God, the liberation from Egypt, offering sacrifices at the temple and all of the things that go along with the Passover meal. So there was just this huge throng of pilgrims who came down. And Jesus's ministry up until this point has been happening primarily in northern Palestine. So his reputation up there as not only a teacher, but a miracle worker, and even many have been whispering the promised Messiah has grown by leaps and bounds. So the people who are coming are expecting something big, that this guy who is a teacher and a miracle worker and a Messiah is coming to Jerusalem on the holiday that celebrates God liberating them from the evil empire when they are currently under the rule of another evil empire, right? This is politically charged. And so they have this idea, many of them, That when Jesus rides into Jerusalem, it's going to be this political act, this liberating act. And that's why so many of them grab the palm fronds and wave them and sing these songs that were sung when a new king of Israel ascended to the throne, right? They were, we might call them today like inauguration hymns, right? And so again, that's not a mistake. They didn't just like randomly choose a song and happen to hit on that one. They are expressing their political aspirations here. They are saying, we expect Jesus to ride in as a conquering hero. We expect him to liberate us from Rome. We expect him to put us back on top and make Israel great again. Then the other group is the disciples. And they're a mixed bag, right? None of them really understand what Jesus is doing, even though he's told them multiple times, hey, when we get to Jerusalem, I'm going to be handed over to the authorities and crucified. Like that just can't process in their brains, right? Have you ever had that happen where someone told you something and it's just like so far outside the realm of possibility for you that it just doesn't even register? And then it happens and you're like, oh yeah, I mean, they did warn me that. I should have known that, right? That's kind of what happens with the disciples. They can't imagine a world where Jesus is going to get handed over to the Roman authorities and crucified. Like it just doesn't compute, which is why, again, spoilers for later in the week, right? When he does get arrested, they all abandon him. They all flee because they're shocked and horrified, again, even though Jesus has told them multiple times this is going to happen. Most of the disciples, as far as we can tell, had similar political aspirations to the pilgrims who came down with them from northern Palestine. They seem to have it in their heads that Jesus is going to be this sort of liberating Messiah, this conquering Messiah, who's going to, again, take the reins of political power, become a new David. If you remember a few weeks ago when we talked about David and his proximity to Jerusalem. And Jesus has said again and again and again, I'm a prophet of God. I am God, right? And we know that it doesn't end well for prophets in Jerusalem. But they can't hear that. All they can see is the glory that will happen when they're back on top and when they get into the seat of power. So I'm sure you can probably see how this connects to Christian nationalism, right? Many of the people who were on either side of this were very nervous that Jesus had nationalist aspirations, that what he was doing was going to be politically disruptive, that it was going to either upset the Romans in a way that caused them to clamp down with violence, or was going to kick the Romans out and put Jesus and the people who thought like Jesus back on top. That's why, for instance, James and John ask if they can be on his right and left, because they think he's going to be on a throne and that they're going to get to be his two chief advisors. So I want to take all of that into our Beacon conversations this week. I want to ask where you think you would have been in those conversations, where you would have been in following Jesus in, because I think it's so easy for us to imagine that Jesus is on our side rather than ask what it means for us to be on Jesus's side. And it's the fact that no one asked if they were on Jesus's side that ended up causing them to abandon him when things got real, because they could not fathom that what was happening was part of Jesus's plan, that his plan was not to conquer, but as we've been talking about throughout the series, make himself vulnerable. I look forward to this conversation. I think it's going to be challenging. I think it's going to be provocative, and I think it's going to be really important for us. So until Sunday, when we gather on our beacons to talk about it, grace and peace be with you.